The stranger knocked only once, the way a man does when he is too tired to knock twice. The wind moved low across the desert floor that night, dragging dust through the mesquite trees and pressing cold against the thin walls of Ayanna Redbird's cabin. Most people would have kept the door closed. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest town and nearly 50 from the nearest sheriff, a knock after sunset usually meant trouble. But Ayanna had learned something about the world that most settlers never understood. Sometimes trouble arrived quietly, wearing the face of a man who had nowhere else left to go. She sat still beside the small iron stove, listening. The knock had been soft, not desperate, just tired. Outside, a horse shifted its weight, leather creaking in the darkness. That told her more than the knock itself. A thief rarely rode a horse that sounded that exhausted. Slowly she stood and crossed the narrow room, her boots whispering across the wooden floorboards. The fire behind her cracked once, throwing orange light across the rough door. When she opened it, the night air rushed inside, carrying the smell of dust, leather, and distant rain. The man standing there looked like he had traveled a long way. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, his hat pulled low, and the horse behind him hung its head as if the road itself had finally caught up with it. The stranger didn't reach for anything, didn't step forward. He just looked at her with the calm patience of someone who knew he might be turned away. "Evening, ma'am," he said, voice low and steady. "I was hoping for a little fire and a little roof. Just for the night." Ayanna studied him carefully. Years living on the edge of two worlds had taught her how to read people the way other folks read tracks in the sand. His boots were dusty but well-made. His hands carried calluses, but not the kind a drifter usually had. And his eyes, tired as they were, moved slowly across the land around her cabin, measuring distance, hills, the tree line. This was not a careless man. The horse behind him snorted softly. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind slid between the two figures standing in the doorway, carrying the faint creak of saddle leather and the distant call of a night bird somewhere out across the valley. Finally Ayanna stepped aside. "Your horse looks worse than you," she said quietly. "Bring him to the trough before he falls asleep standing." The man blinked once, as if surprised by the kindness. Then he gave a small nod. "Much obliged." While he led the horse toward the wooden trough beside the cabin, Ayanna watched the horizon out of habit. The desert had a way of telling you when something was coming. Tonight it felt quiet, but quiet out here never lasted long. When the stranger returned a few minutes later, he removed his hat as he stepped inside. The firelight reached his face now, revealing tired lines and a calm expression that didn't quite match the worn clothes he wore. "Name's Nate," he said simply. Ayanna handed him a tin cup filled with hot coffee. People out here usually give more than a first name. Nate accepted the cup and wrapped his hands around it like a man who hadn't felt warmth in a while. Sometimes a first name is safer. Ayanna didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing across the desert grass like a warning that hadn't fully decided to speak yet. She had no way of knowing that the quiet man warming his hands beside her fire was not just another wandering cowboy lost between towns. And she certainly didn't know that before the moon had turned twice, riders would come searching this valley for the richest man in the entire Wild West. The fire settled into a slow, steady glow as the night stretched across the desert, and the small cabin filled with the quiet sounds of wood popping inside the iron stove and wind brushing the dry grass outside. Nate sat at the rough wooden table, turning the warm tin cup slowly in his hands, letting the heat return to his fingers. Across the room, Ayanna moved with the calm rhythm of someone who had lived alone long enough to make silence feel natural. She added another piece of mesquite wood to the stove and hung a small iron pot above the flame. The smell of beans and dried herbs slowly filled the room. Nate watched her for a moment before speaking. "You live out here by yourself?" His voice was careful, not curious in the way men from towns often sounded when they looked at a native cabin like it was some kind of strange sight. Ayanna nodded once while stirring the pot. 3 years now. Outside, the horse shifted near the trough, the quiet splash of water carrying through the still desert air. Nate glanced toward the window. Not many people choose a place 30 miles from the nearest town. Ayanna gave a small shrug as if the distance meant very little to her. Some people are not given much choice. She set a second cup of coffee beside him and then sat down across the table. The firelight flickered across the walls, revealing the few things she owned. A saddle carefully repaired more than once. A small shelf of dried plants tied with twine. A worn blanket folded near the corner bed. Nate noticed how little there was, and how carefully everything had been kept. Town does not welcome Apache women selling medicine and leather, she added quietly. Nate nodded as if he already understood something about that kind of distance between people. Towns have a way of deciding who belongs, he said. For a moment neither spoke. The wind outside had softened, and the sky beyond the window held the pale glow of a rising moon. Ayanna filled 2 simple bowls and slid one toward him across the table. Nate hesitated slightly. You sure you have enough? She gave him a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. If a traveler knocks politely, there is always enough. Nate began eating slowly, like a man who had learned long ago that food tasted better when it lasted a little longer. The beans were simple but warm, and the quiet cabin felt safer than the open miles he had crossed that day. After a few minutes, Ayanna leaned back slightly, studying him the same way she had studied his horse earlier. You ride like a man who has seen many miles, she said. But your hands do not belong to a drifting cowboy. Nate looked down at his palms for a moment before letting out a soft breath. People change work when the road changes, he answered. The answer did not satisfy her curiosity, but she did not press further. Instead, she listened to the night again. Living alone had taught her to trust small sounds the way other people trusted maps. Somewhere far out across the valley, a faint echo of hoofbeats drifted across the open land, too distant to see, but clear enough to hear if you knew how to listen. Ayanna's eyes moved toward the dark horizon beyond the window. Nate noticed the shift immediately. Something wrong? He asked quietly. She shook her head slowly but did not look away from the desert. Maybe nothing, she said. But sometimes the night carries news before the riders arrive. Nate followed her gaze into the darkness, unaware that somewhere beyond those distant hills men had already begun searching the territory for a traveler who had disappeared from the road, a traveler who now sat quietly beside a fire in the only cabin for miles. The hoofbeats faded into the distance as the night grew deeper, but Ayanna did not move away from the window for a long time. The moon had climbed higher now, casting pale silver across the wide valley and the quiet stretch of desert grass that surrounded her small cabin. Nate watched her from the table, noticing the way she listened to the land the same way other people listened to conversation. Finally, she stepped away from the window and added another piece of mesquite wood to the stove. The fire brightened again, warming the small room with steady orange light. You travel often? She asked after a moment. Nate leaned back slightly in the chair, stretching tired muscles that had known too many miles in too few days. More than I should lately, he answered. His voice carried the calm tone of a man who had learned to speak carefully without sounding like he was hiding something. Ayanna studied him again, the way someone studies a trail that does not quite match the tracks around it. The dust on his coat looked real enough, and the road had clearly been long, but there were other details that did not fit the story of a wandering cowboy. The stitching on his boots had been done by a skilled hand. The silver buckle on his belt had been polished recently. Even the way he held the tin cup suggested a man more familiar with quiet rooms than open saloons. She stood and crossed to a small wooden chest beside the wall. From inside, she removed a folded blanket and set it near the narrow bed in the corner. You can sleep there, she said. Nate shook his head gently. The floor will do fine. She looked at him with the calm patience of someone who had no interest in arguing about simple things. The floor is for men who arrive without knocking. For a moment Nate said nothing. Then a faint smile crossed his face, and he gave a quiet nod. Outside the horse shifted again, the sound of water dripping from its muzzle into the trough. Nate glanced toward the door. Your horse sounds old, he said. Ayanna followed his gaze toward the darkness outside. He is older than most men who ride him, she replied. But he knows these hills better than I do. Nate finished the last of the coffee and placed the cup carefully on the table. The warmth from the stove had begun to soften the exhaustion in his shoulders, but his mind remained alert in the way it always did when the road had not yet finished with him. You said the town does not welcome you, he said quietly. Ayanna leaned against the wall near the stove. Some people see a name before they see a person. Nate nodded slowly as if the thought felt familiar. And sometimes people see a man's coat before they see the truth. The fire crackled between them, the sound filling the small pause that followed. Outside, the desert had grown very still again. The distant hoofbeats that had passed earlier were gone now, leaving only the whisper of wind moving through the grass and the faint rustle of night birds along the ridge. Ayana finally sat beside the stove, folding her hands loosely in her lap. "If someone was looking for you," she said quietly, "this valley would hide you well." Nate looked toward the window where the moonlight painted long shadows across the floorboards. For a moment his expression carried the weight of a man who had been riding ahead of trouble for many miles. Then he simply said, "Sometimes hiding is only a short rest before the road finds you again." Ayana nodded as if she understood that kind of truth better than most people. Neither of them knew that beyond the distant hills the search had already begun to grow larger, and that before many days passed, riders would cross these quiet plains asking questions about a wandering traveler who had disappeared into the desert night. Morning came slowly across the desert, the pale gold light spreading over the valley as if the sun itself was careful not to disturb the quiet land too quickly. Ayana was already awake when the first light touched the hills. Living alone had trained her body to rise with the dawn, long before the heat of the day settled across the sand and stone. She stepped outside the cabin carrying a small wooden bucket and paused for a moment to study the horizon. The valley stretched wide and empty for miles in every direction, broken only by scattered mesquite trees and the distant ridge that turned dark purple against the early sky. Nate's horse lifted its head from the trough and watched her calmly. The animal already looked stronger than it had the night before, though the long road still lingered in its tired posture. Ayana ran a gentle hand along the horse's neck before filling the bucket with fresh water from the small barrel beside the cabin. Behind her the cabin door opened with a quiet creak. Nate stepped outside, hat in hand, his eyes adjusting to the morning light. For a moment, he simply stood there breathing in the cool desert air like a man who had not expected to see another sunrise in a peaceful place. "You wake early," he said. Ayana set the bucket beside the trough. "The desert wakes earlier than people." Nate nodded, glancing across the open land as if measuring the distance to the next mile of road he would eventually need to travel. The silence between them felt calm, but Ayana's eyes had already begun studying the far hills again. Something about the morning did not feel the same as most mornings. The wind was too still, the birds too quiet. Nate followed her gaze toward the horizon. At first he saw nothing but empty land. Then, far beyond the ridge nearly 2 miles away, a faint ribbon of dust lifted slowly into the air. It was small enough that a careless traveler might miss it. But Ayana did not miss things like that. "Riders," she said quietly. Nate's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the distant dust rise and fall with the rhythm of moving horses. The group was still too far away to count clearly, but the pattern told him enough. More than one rider. Possibly several. "Could be traders," he said calmly though. His voice carried the careful tone of a man thinking through possibilities. Ayana shook her head slowly. "Traders do not ride this direction. The road to town is 15 miles east." Nate did not answer immediately. The dust cloud grew slightly larger as the riders moved closer across the valley floor. Still distant, still quiet, but moving with clear purpose. Ayana leaned lightly against the wooden fence beside the trough, her eyes steady on the approaching horizon. "If they are looking for someone," she said softly, "they will ask questions." Nate rested his hands on the fence rail beside her, his expression thoughtful but calm. "And if they ask about a tired cowboy who stayed the night?" Ayana turned her head toward him. The morning light revealed the quiet strength in her expression. "Then I will tell them I saw a man who knocked politely and rode away before sunrise." Nate looked back toward the rising dust on the horizon. The riders were still far enough away that their shapes remained small against the wide desert, but their direction had not changed. They were coming straight toward the valley. After a moment, Nate reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small silver coin. He turned it once in the morning light before placing it quietly on the wooden rail of the fence beside Ayana. "If anyone asks," he said calmly, "perhaps they will believe you helped a man who had nothing at all." Ayana looked down at the coin resting against the sunlit wood. The metal gleamed brighter than anything a wandering cowboy usually carried. When she looked back up, Nate was already walking toward his horse, the desert wind lifting slightly as the distant riders continued their slow approach across the wide and silent valley. The morning sun climbed slowly above the ridge as Nate tightened the saddle strap on his tired horse. The animal stood quietly beside the fence, its ears turning now and then toward the distant riders who continued to move across the valley nearly 2 miles away. The dust behind them had grown thicker, rising into the air in a long pale trail that shimmered in the early light. Ayanna remained beside the wooden fence where Nate had left the coin. She had not touched it yet. The silver caught the sunlight in a way that felt almost out of place against the weathered rail of her small cabin. Out here, coins like that did not travel alone. Nate swung the saddle blanket into place and checked the reins with the practiced movement of a man who had ridden longer roads than most travelers ever saw. When he finished, he rested his hand briefly along the horse's neck and looked back toward the cabin. Ayanna was still watching him with the quiet patience that seemed to follow everything she did. "You should ride before they reach the valley," she said calmly. Nate followed her gaze toward the horizon where the riders were now easier to see. The shapes of horses moved slowly across the open land, their paths steady and deliberate. Even from this distance, it was clear they were not wandering travelers. They were searching. Nate nodded slightly. That would be the smart choice. He lifted the reins, but did not mount yet. Instead, he walked a few steps back toward the fence where Ayanna stood. The desert wind had begun to move again, carrying warm air across the valley as the morning continued to grow brighter. Nate looked down at the silver coin resting on the rail between them. "You can keep that," he said quietly, "for the horse feed you gave my friend." Ayanna finally picked up the coin, turning it once between her fingers. The weight of it felt wrong for a wandering cowboy who claimed to have nothing. "A man who carries coins like this is not usually hiding from empty roads," she said. Nate smiled faintly, though there was something thoughtful behind the expression. Sometimes the road is the only place left where a man can breathe without people knowing his name. The riders had come closer now, perhaps 1.5 miles away. Their shapes were clearer against the bright desert floor, though the distance still blurred their faces. Ayanna studied them quietly before speaking again. "They are not riding like traders." Nate leaned lightly against the fence beside her and watched the horizon with calm eyes. "No," he agreed. "They are not." The wind lifted a strand of dust along the ground between the cabin and the open valley. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nate straightened and placed his hat back on his head. "I will ride west," he said. "There is a dry canyon about 12 miles. That way. If they follow the road east, they will miss me." Ayanna looked toward the western hills he had mentioned. The land there was rough and narrow, filled with winding paths only someone familiar with the desert would recognize. "The canyon forks after 3 miles, she said. "Take the left trail when the rock wall turns red. The right path ends at a dry wash." Nate glanced at her with quiet appreciation. "You know these hills well." "The hills are kinder than towns," she replied simply. Nate placed one foot in the stirrup and swung easily into the saddle. The horse shifted beneath him, ready to move again despite the miles already behind it. Before turning toward the western hills, Nate looked back at the cabin one last time. Ayanna still stood beside the fence, the silver coin resting in her palm as the morning sun brightened the valley around them. In the distance, the riders continued their steady approach, unaware that the man they had been searching for all night had already begun to disappear once more into the wide and patient desert. The sound of Nate's horse faded slowly into the western hills until the only thing left in the valley was the whisper of wind moving through dry grass. Ayanna remained beside the fence long after he disappeared from sight. The silver coin rested in her palm, warm now from the sunlight, and heavier than a single night of shelter should have been worth. She closed her fingers around it and slipped it quietly into the small pocket sewn into her belt. The riders on the horizon were closer now. What had once been a distant cloud of dust had turned into clear shapes against the wide desert floor. She counted them carefully the way her grandfather had once taught her to count moving shadows across the land. 1 rider in front, 5 behind him, 6 horses in total. They rode in a straight line toward the cabin as if they already knew where they were going. Ayanna stepped away from the fence and moved toward the trough, lifting the empty bucket again as if her morning chores had not changed at all. The horse Nate had ridden was gone now, leaving only the quiet creak of the wooden fence and the distant rhythm of approaching hooves. A few minutes later, the riders reached the edge of the valley. Their horses slowed as they approached the cabin, the dust settling slowly around them. The man in front sat tall in the saddle, his coat clean and dark against the bright desert sun. His eyes scanned the land with the careful attention of someone used to searching large places for small signs. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the short distance. "Morning." Ayana nodded once, but did not step closer. "Morning." The rider studied her calmly. "We are looking for a traveler," he said. "A man riding a tired brown horse. Came through this territory sometime last night." Ayana dipped the bucket into the trough again and let the water fill slowly. "Many travelers pass through the desert," she said. The man watched her for a moment, then glanced toward the cabin, the fence, and the open valley around them. One of the other riders leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "He was last seen on the southern road about 20 miles from here," the second man added. "If he came this direction, this would be the only shelter for miles." Ayana lifted the bucket and poured water slowly into the trough as if the question required no hurry at all. "A man knocked on my door last night," she said finally. The lead rider straightened slightly. "And?" Ayana wiped her hands on the cloth at her belt and looked directly at him. "He asked for water for his horse." The riders exchanged quick glances. "Did he stay?" the leader asked. Ayana shook her head. "He left before sunrise." The man studied her face carefully, searching for hesitation, but the calm in her voice did not change. The desert wind moved gently across the valley again, brushing the dry grass between the horses and the cabin. After a moment, the rider nodded once. "Which direction did he ride?" Ayana lifted her hand and pointed toward the eastern horizon where the long road to town disappeared between two distant hills. "That way," she said simply. The riders turned their heads toward the direction she had shown them. The man in front watched the horizon for a moment before giving a short signal with his hand. The group turned their horses together and began riding east across the valley floor. Within minutes, the dust trail followed them again, slowly shrinking against the wide, open land. Ayana stood beside the trough until the riders disappeared beyond the distant ridge. Only when the valley grew quiet again did she glance toward the western hills where Nate had gone. The desert wind carried nothing now but sunlight and empty silence, as if the land itself had quietly agreed to keep a traveler's secret. The valley remained quiet long after the riders disappeared beyond the eastern ridge, but Ayana did not move back inside the cabin right away. She stood beside the trough listening to the wind and watching the wide stretch of land the way someone listens for a final echo after a door has closed. The desert had a way of carrying sounds farther than people expected, and sometimes trouble returned long after it seemed to leave. But this morning the land stayed calm. The dust from the riders slowly settled back onto the dry grass, and the sky stretched clear and blue above the empty hills. Only then did Ayana turn toward the cabin. She stepped inside and placed the empty bucket near the door before sitting down at the small wooden table. The silver coin rested heavy in the pocket at her belt. For a moment she considered leaving it there, but curiosity finally won. She removed the coin and set it on the table where the morning sunlight reached through the window. The metal caught the light in a sharp, clean glow that felt strange inside a cabin where most things had been repaired many times. Ayana turned the coin slowly between her fingers. The stamp on its surface was not from the nearby town she knew. It carried markings from a larger mint far to the north, the kind of coin a traveler rarely spent unless he carried many more. She leaned back in the chair, thinking about the man who had warmed his hands beside her stove only hours earlier. Nate had spoken like a man used to choosing his words carefully. He had watched the land like someone familiar with danger. And yet he had knocked politely on a stranger's door and thanked her for a bowl of beans, as if the simple meal had been worth more than gold. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing lightly against the cabin walls. Ayana slipped the coin back into her belt pocket and stood. The day's work still waited. She gathered dried herbs from the small shelf and began sorting them carefully into bundles the way her grandmother had once taught her. Time passed quietly as the sun climbed higher across the desert sky. By midday, the heat had begun to settle over the valley, pressing warm air against the hills and turning the distant rocks pale beneath the light. Ayana stepped outside again to stretch her back. The valley looked the same as it always did. Empty land, quiet wind, and endless sky. Yet something about the morning lingered in her thoughts. The riders had been searching for someone important. Even the way their leader had spoken carried the calm authority of men used to serving a powerful employer. She wondered briefly who Nate truly was and why men would ride miles across the desert to find him. But the desert did not answer questions like that. It only held its silence. As the afternoon shadows slowly began to stretch across the valley floor, Ayanna noticed something new along the far western hills. At first it looked like nothing more than another shimmer of dust rising against the distant ridge. But this time the dust did not come from 6 horses or even 10. The cloud was larger, much larger. It rolled slowly across the western horizon like a moving wall of pale desert wind. Ayanna narrowed her eyes and stepped closer to the fence, shading her face with one hand as she watched the distant movement. The riders were still miles away, but there were many more of them than before. Far too many to be traders, and far too many to be lost travelers wandering the desert road. The dust cloud along the western hills continued to grow as the afternoon sun hung high above the valley. At first the movement looked like a distant storm rolling across the desert floor, but Ayanna knew better than to mistake riders for weather. She stepped closer to the fence and rested her hands along the warm wood, watching carefully as the shapes slowly began to separate within the drifting dust. 1 rider became 3, 3 became 10, and soon it was clear there were many more than that. The desert carried the faint rhythm of hooves long before the riders themselves were close enough to see clearly. Ayanna listened to the sound the way someone listens to a river before it comes into view. These horses were not wandering. They moved in steady formation, their pace calm but deliberate. Whoever rode with them knew exactly where they were going. The sun slid slowly westward as the long line of riders approached the valley. Their silhouettes finally rose against the ridge like dark shapes carved into the light. Ayanna counted again, narrowing her eyes against the brightness of the desert afternoon. 20 riders at least, maybe more behind them that she could not yet see through the dust. They did not rush forward like hunters chasing prey. Instead, they slowed as they entered the valley, spreading out slightly across the wide land, as if careful not to disturb something important. The lead rider moved ahead of the others, guiding his horse steadily toward the cabin. When he reached the fence line, he brought the horse to a calm halt. For a moment, neither he nor Ayanna spoke. The wind shifted across the valley, lifting the dust from the riders behind him and revealing more horses standing quietly along the slope nearly 200 yards away. Ayanna recognized the man in the saddle before he removed his hat. Nate looked different now. His coat had been brushed clean of road dust. The horse beneath him was no longer the tired animal that had arrived at her door the night before. This horse stood tall and strong, its saddle polished and well kept. Even the way the other riders waited behind him spoke clearly of respect. Ayanna folded her arms lightly across the fence rail and looked up at him. "You rode west," she said calmly. Nate smiled faintly beneath the brim of his hat. "I did." He glanced briefly toward the hills behind her cabin before returning his gaze to her. "And I told them to ride east." Ayanna studied the long line of riders waiting across the valley. Their horses stood quiet and disciplined, their riders watching with the calm patience of men used to waiting for orders. "Those men this morning were searching for someone important," she said. Nate nodded once. They were. The desert wind carried a soft rustle through the grass between them. For a moment neither spoke. Then one of the riders behind Nate slowly approached, carrying a leather satchel. He stopped beside Nate's horse and handed the satchel upward with quiet respect before returning to the line. Nate opened the satchel and removed a folded set of papers sealed with a small brass emblem. He leaned slightly forward in the saddle and placed the documents carefully on the wooden rail in front of Ayanna. "The land around this valley," he said gently, "about 300 acres stretching from the Red Canyon to the southern ridge, now belongs to you." Ayanna did not touch the papers right away. Her eyes lifted slowly back to Nate's face. "You are not a wandering cowboy," she said. Nate rested one hand along the saddle horn and looked out across the quiet valley before answering. "No," he said softly. "But last night you treated me like a man who had nothing, and that is something I have not felt in many years." The valley grew quiet again after Nate placed the papers on the wooden rail, but the silence felt different now. The riders behind him remained still across the open land, their horses standing calmly in the warm afternoon light, as if the desert itself had asked them to wait. Ayanna looked down at the documents resting on the fence. The paper edges moved slightly in the breeze, the brass seal catching the sunlight the same way the silver coin had earlier that morning. Slowly she reached forward and touched the top page with the tips of her fingers. The paper felt thick and official, the kind of document usually carried inside offices in large towns far from places like this valley. Her eyes moved across the writing even though she already understood what it meant. Land. 300 acres. From the Red Canyon in the west to the southern ridge where the valley opened toward the plains. The land she had walked every day for 3 years now belonged to her. She lifted her gaze back to Nate. You could have given this land to anyone, she said quietly. Nate rested both hands loosely on the saddle horn as the wind moved through the tall grass around the cabin. Most men I meet expect something in return, he replied. You gave shelter to a stranger who looked like he had nothing to offer. Ayanna studied him for a moment, remembering the man who had sat beside the small iron stove the night before, warming his hands around a simple cup of coffee. You were not hiding because you were poor, she said. Nate smiled faintly. No, the desert stretched wide and calm behind him, the long line of riders still waiting across the valley like quiet shadows against the hills. Sometimes a man with too much money spends his life wondering if anyone would treat him the same way without it. The wind lifted again, carrying the soft creak of saddle leather and the distant call of a hawk circling above the ridge. Ayanna folded the papers carefully and held them against her chest. For the first time since the riders arrived, the hint of a smile touched her expression. You knock politely, she said. Nate laughed softly under his breath. My mother taught me that lesson a long time ago. He tipped his hat slightly before turning his horse. The animal stepped calmly away from the fence, the leather saddle shining beneath the afternoon sun. The riders behind him straightened as he approached, their quiet formation shifting like a slow-moving line across the valley floor. Before he rode too far, Nate looked back once more toward the small cabin and the woman standing beside the fence with the land papers in her hands. Ayanna, he called across the wind. She lifted her head. Yes. Nate rested one hand on the reins and smiled the same quiet smile he had worn the night before beside her fire. If anyone ever knocks on your door again after sunset, I hope you open it the same way. Ayanna nodded once. If they knock politely. Nate tipped his hat again and turned his horse west toward the long red canyon that stretched across the horizon. The riders followed him slowly, their line moving across the desert until the dust of their passing began to fade into the wide, open sky. Soon the valley returned to silence once more. Only the wind remained, brushing gently across 300 acres of land that now belonged to a woman who had once given a wandering stranger nothing more than a warm fire and a place to rest.